Welcome to the short pre-recorded lecture on history as an intertext in Alan Moore and David Gibbons's graphic novel Watchmen. Unlike novelists, historians do not have the choice of providing happy endings. Thus begins the concluding chapter of Paul S. Boyer's American History, a very short introduction. However, you should be aware that historians, through a process of selecting what they will write about and the kind of language they use to describe those events, can greatly influence the story of history. The first section of this chapter, A Society in Transition, focuses on a demographic shift, a decline in manufacturing jobs, and a growing skepticism to mainstream media. The demographic shift essentially means that more immigrants are coming from Asia and Latin America in this period, and relatively fewer from Europe. The decline in manufacturing jobs displaced many factory workers into lower-paid service industry jobs. And the skepticism to mainstream media, probably beginning already with the 1972 election cycle, can be seen today in the growth of the alternative internet media, and by the fact that newspaper publication in the United States today is at the same levels as in the early 1940s. The next section deals with the Vietnam War, the presidency of Richard Nixon, and some elements of the Arab oil embargo. In particular, the last four items on this slide are important with regard to Alan Moore's and Dave Gibbons's graphic novel Watchmen, and that is the Watergate scandal, where Nixon is forced to resign from the presidency in August of 1973 and is succeeded by Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford. The Arab oil embargo of the same year, in which OPEC countries decided not to export to the United States due to the United States' policies in the Mideast. And in 1975, the fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War, and the victory of the North Vietnamese army. And James Earl Carter being elected president and his dealing with the Iranian hostage crisis. A shift to the political right in tandem with growing cultural conservatism, already well underway during the Nixon years, continued when Ronald Reagan, a former governor of California, defeated Jimmy Carter for the presidency in 1980. I quote from Boyer, "By the 1970s, a host of issues, including abortion, the federal ban on school prayer, the gay rights movement, and a sexually permissive mass media, convinced many evangelicals, as well as conservative Roman Catholics, that the United States was on the wrong path." These issues can be seen iconically in this image from Watchmen. In addition, we have the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan and Reagan providing covert aid to fight the Soviets. And in 1984, to combat growing influence of Cuba and the Soviet Union in the country of Nicaragua and El Salvador, the Reagan administration, or some people who worked in the Reagan administration, arranged to sell weapons to Iran in order to funnel that money to a group of fighters called the Contras, who were working against the communist forces in Latin America. The reason that I mention this is the quote that begins the graphic novel Watchmen, "Who watches the Watchmen?" was likely taken from the 1987 Tower Commission report on this particular political occurrence. We are almost ready to see how these historical events are used by Alan Moore and David Gibbons in the graphic novel. But first, we must consider a couple of issues. What is intertextuality? An established text or event from outside the text that carries significance within the text. You've seen some examples already. For instance, the references to the William Blake poetry or Bob Dylan songs in Watchmen. Those are texts from outside of Watchmen that are brought into Watchmen and carry significance. You've also seen intertextuality in other works on the syllabus. For instance, literary allusions function as a kind of intertext. For instance, in T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. Am an attendant lord. This brings the text of Hamlet by William Shakespeare into the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The philosopher Julia Kristeva has said that just about anything is actually intertext, that all texts are essentially composed out of previous texts. While a radical position, it is an interesting one. What happens when history is an intertext? Well, Watchmen is an alternative history. It is characterizing the precise period when it was being published only as an alternative history, not the reality in which it was published. This is frequently a subcategory of science fiction and may facilitate social satirical elements of a work. We have Ward Moore's Bring the Jubilee from 1953, in which the Southern Confederacy wins the American Civil War, and you may be familiar with Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, in which the United States is split between Japan and Germany. This is an alternative history. And this subgenre often triggers what we may call an estranged view of the real circumstances. And I would like to point out two examples from the graphic novel Watchmen: the ending of the Vietnam War and a portrayal of Nixon's government. As already mentioned, the regime of North Vietnam won the Vietnam War in 1975. This famous photograph in the upper left-hand corner is people fleeing the country to get on board American helicopters to be evacuated from the country before the city of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, was completely overrun. Notice how Moore and Gibbons skillfully employ that exact same image, however, in reverse. In the graphic novel, the United States and South Vietnam have won the Vietnam War, and we see a helicopter on top of the American embassy with people getting out of it. And chief among them is President Richard Nixon. So in this alternative history, there is no Watergate, there is no resignation, there is no Jimmy Carter. Richard Nixon is still president all the way until the 1980s. The next element I would like to focus on is the political figures of Nixon's cabinet during the start of World War III, or at very least, the risk of starting World War III. As you reread these pages, please be informed that Liddy refers to G. Gordon Liddy, a major figure in the Watergate scandal, but also a part of the Nixon cabinet. The reference to East German tanks being amassed in the second panel on the top also echoes the problems of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I discussed in a former lecture. That they are already up to DEFCON 2 is a real situation that would have happened, but I would like you to look where the depiction of Richard Nixon's hand on something that looks like an American football. And this actually is called the football, and here an officer of the United States Army is carrying it for a president. It's a rather large attaché case that launches the nuclear weapons. The takeaways from this short talk involve the terms intertextuality, alternative history, and estrangement. Alan Moore and David Gibbons' Watchmen is richly intertextual, with references to popular songs, poetry, and even the Tower Commission report, in addition to references of historical significance. In an alternative history, a key historical juncture is changed to present an estranged view of the circumstances. We look upon our everyday life with new eyes. Watchmen uses the alternative history to make strange, or estrange, American foreign policy and the strategy of mutually assured destruction, the defense policy that holds that a balance of total nuclear annihilation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is the best possible strategic deterrent. Now, of course, these are not the only elements of society that Moore and Gibbons satirize in Watchmen, but they are the main ones with regard to the use of alternative history. This concludes this short lecture. I hope you've gotten something out of it and that you found it interesting. I thank you for your attention.